So everybody keeps telling you to start using Docker finally. Or maybe you got your first contact with Docker, but you're still not quite sure what the benefits are. Well, you've come to the right place. This video is just for you. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Chris and today we are going to talk about Docker. I would like to clarify two important questions. Number one, what even is Docker? And number two, how it will benefit you and how it will make your life as a developer so much better. But before we can do that, we need to go back in time and see how things used to be before we had Docker. So it's 2005. I just started out with a new employer and I was responsible for kicking off the internet business. And of course, the problems were less complex back then, but still a lot of things have changed since then. So my initial choice of technology was PHP and MySQL back then for creating the website. And after the first initial few weeks, I already bumped into the first problem with deployment. So in order to deploy a website nowadays, you just spin up a DigitalOcean droplet or you go to Amazon Web Services or any other service, and it's quite easy. But back then, it wasn't that simple. I couldn't just deploy things. I had to talk to a specific team. It was an infrastructure team. They were responsible for networking, machines, the support and all those things, and of course the deployment to the web. And while I was working on the first version of the website, I used Apache as a web server, and this is something that I couldn't use in the deployment because the company was a Microsoft partner, and obviously they had to use Microsoft technologies on the server. So first of all, the web server couldn't be Apache, it had to be an IIS server, which was, I think, Internet Information Service. And instead of the MySQL database, we had to use the Microsoft SQL server. So those were the first troubles that we ran into, where we spent, I think, 2 days configuring together with the sysadmin the server so the website could run on it. Well, 2 days are a lot, specifically looking from nowadays perspective, right? But back then things took a bit longer. It was okay, and I thought anyway, it's just an initial setup. It will be so much better the next releases. Boy, was I wrong. So things got better, but still, we came down to a day, to half a day, hours, and yeah, ultimately to a few minutes. But still, it was a long process to get there. And with time, I started to grow a team there. So I hired developers into my team, and we could iterate faster. We made changes, and we wanted to deploy them as soon as possible. And every time going through a long process was quite daunting. Not only that, we already figured we had problems already between the developer machines, right? So you know the term works on my machine. We used that a lot back then. Simply because there was a specific module that would work only in this specific version on that machine, but it wouldn't work on another one, right? And it got even worse when we deployed it to a different environment, right? Because it was a different web server, it was a different database, hundreds of things could go wrong. So we never had full control over the environment. And this is something that Docker can really do well for you. Back then we didn't have the Docker, so we didn't fix it with Docker, but this is something that you have right now and you can use it to your advantage. Let's move on a few years. We understood that we need to get better control of the environment. We need to be able to be as close to the deployment environment as possible on our developer machines. But how were we supposed to do that? We couldn't just go on and go to the web server and try to install library X and library Y and hope that it works. And once it's there, we just make a backup and move on with our lives. This was not very safe way to go about it. So finally, the time arose where new tooling came to the market, tools that would take care of provisioning your environment. If I remember correctly, those were Chef, Puppet, Salt, Ansible, and those kind of names that I recall. And And those tools had a very simple, let's call it a simple but very important job. So they would take care of provisioning your setup. It would just define how a specific machine should look like. So you'd give the roles like this is a database machine or this is a web server machine, and you would define what are the necessary steps to get to a given state, what libraries have to be installed, what versions should be installed there, and all the rest of the setup, what files should be copied over, and so on and so on. And these kind of software products would take care of provisioning all your network setup, your machines to come into a given state, which was something that was automated. You wouldn't have to take care of it manually anymore. And on top of that, we would use on our local developer machines VirtualBox and use the same tooling to provision those virtual machines, so we could experience the very same setup while developing as it would be then later on in deployment. So this was a great improvement already, but things were still not perfect. It still happened that some machines were provisioned wrongly, the state wasn't perfect, we would have to clean up manually or ditch machines and replace them with new ones, but it was already better. So let's move forward a few years. I think it's 2014. I heard the term Docker the first time, but I still didn't know what it is. It still took me a few more months before I actually looked into Docker. So what is Docker? I think the easiest way to explain Docker is if you look at virtual machines. So virtual machines are products like VirtualBox or VMware and things like that. Basically, it's a way to split your machine into smaller chunks, into virtual machines, basically. How virtual machines work is quite simple. You have an operating system, you have a hypervisor, and this hypervisor allows you to make those smaller chunks. So you dedicate CPU, memory, and space to a virtual machine, and you can have multiple of those on your host environment, and each one of them is completely separated. And inside those virtual machines, you have your operating system that you want to install, you put in your libraries that you need, and basically your software that you want to run. And this is quite nice because you have a complete separation. So you could have a database server and a web server all running on the same host environment and still being completely separated. So you have complete control over the environment. But the downside is that it takes time to boot up a virtual machine because it's still a regular operating system, right? Even if it's virtual, it's still an operating system that needs time to start. And this is where Docker comes into the game and makes it so much better. So if you look at Docker, you are on some operating system, and instead of an hypervisor, you have something called Docker Engine. And this Docker Engine allows you to run Docker containers. And Docker containers are basically encapsulated versions of an environment that you would like to run your code inside. So inside such a Docker container, you would have the libraries that you want to have installed there and your application. And basically the difference between Docker and virtual machines is that it uses the kernel of the host environment, of the host operating system, which makes it so much faster because it doesn't need to boot anything and it doesn't take seconds. It just runs your application within milliseconds. And you get the full control of separating your environment because you still have the libraries that you would like to have installed there in your container. You have the separation and you have the speed. So it's quite nice solution. And ever since I discovered Docker, I used it all the time for every project because I believe this is the only way how to deploy nowadays things. I'm sure by now you're wondering what a Docker container looks like, and to really simplify it, I would just say it's a file system. All the files that you need to run your software. So Docker container itself is just an instance of a Docker image. And a Docker image is something that you would create by instructions. So think of it like a blueprint for building your environment for your application. What do you need? You need an operating system, Debian, Ubuntu, whatever in Linux terms. You need to update some libraries on this machine. You want to run Node in a specific version, or PHP or Java, doesn't really matter, but whatever will run your software, you need to install all those things. So you put up instructions there in your Docker file and create this environment by installing the software that you need, installing libraries in specific versions, putting your software there, building it, compiling it, whatever, and just leaving the instruction there how to run it. And this will create your blueprint, your Docker image, which you can then deploy on any machine that runs Docker. So it will run on your machine, it will run on the server, it will run on your friends, on your mom's machine, doesn't really matter. As long as Docker engine is there, you can run your software, which simplifies deployment so much, because you don't go to a server, you don't install libraries manually, you don't have to keep synchronization going with specific tools. You just have your ready-made Docker container, which has your software baked into it, and you simply run it. Within milliseconds, you start it and it's there. It's just one process and it works. And the beauty of this is that not only is it portable like that, but it's scalable, because once you made a copy, you can make a second copy and a fifth and a 10th and a 100th copy. You can scale it out in your environment, and just by simply saying you want to start more copies of it. This is really nice, wouldn't you say so? Another great benefit of Docker is that there's a huge ecosystem around it. Almost any open source project that you can think of, you can find on Docker Hub as a ready-made image that you can immediately use right instantly. I can remember those times many years ago where I would try to make some library work, and for that I would need to install another library and download some software and source code, compile it, build it with some different tools, having errors, going to the next version, moving on, and after 2 days having finally a working library, but no clue how I got there. So it was something that I couldn't replicate on a server. Basically, I lost 2 days of time and got nowhere. And with Docker, it's so much easier, because I want to run Postgres in version 10, I just run it. And after I'm done, I delete it and it's gone. No pollution of my environment. And I can switch between versions anytime. It's so much easier. All right, we got 3 important things now with Docker. First off, portability. So once it's a Docker container, it runs anywhere where Docker runs, which is quite nice. Second, we have security, because it's encapsulated, so it doesn't share context with other Docker containers, and brings an additional level of security. And third, we have scalability out of the box, because you can run one container, you can run 10, hundreds of them, doesn't really matter, on one machine, more machines. All of this is possible. So scaling out your system will be so much easier. But let's not stop there. There are more things that you can even do with Docker. In another video, I would like to touch on those things. Basically, it's continuous integration, continuous delivery, and in general the topic of how immutable infrastructure can benefit your deployment environment. Also, I'll try to show next time how to get started with Docker. Trust me, it's not that complicated. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next video. I hope I will see you next time. And as always, I wish you bug-free code.